Bryan Munson. Bryan, the upper sort of Midwest is flooding. It's 100 right here in Lincoln right now. In the south central portion of the country, what is the weather situation?
100 degrees. I think it was actually supposed to get up over 100. It was 100 yesterday. Yesterday was our first 100-degree day of the calendar year. Today was supposed to be the second. It was like 101 today. So yeah, it's ugly. It's nasty. It's yucky.
Are you getting a dry heat or is it pretty muggy?
It's still muggy. I mean, like the humidity is still hovering like between 40 and 50%. I mean, it's nasty outside, and it has to do everything with the rain that we got earlier on in the spring. The lakes are all at capacity. There's still a lot of water in the ground, so it is just. It's not that dry heat that typically like you could at least like walk out to your car, get in your car and do it. Like you walk outside, it just like it's immediately on you.
Just know you're not suffering alone, and we will take solace in that we are not suffering alone up here. But let's turn our attention to recruiting, Bryan. The big thing of the last couple of weeks for me has been the post-grad camp headlines for Nebraska. Jalen Gramstad and Hayes Miller added to Nebraska's roster out of those camps. Are other schools running these camps and utilizing them like Nebraska is?
I think that they are. I know that like UNK had something. I mean, that's just me being a former Loper for me to kind of drop that one. But yeah, I think that they are doing it. I don't think typically it's yielding the type of results, Nebraska's been, fairly niche about it, right? I mean, you're looking for a fourth quarterback. Nobody expected that the reigning NAIA Offensive Player of the Year was going to be there. So that's pretty. That's finding a needle in a haystack, right? So you get that opportunity to host a guy like that, and he's interested in kind of coming to being a Husker because that's what he grew up following and all that good stuff. Then you get a backup kicker, potentially to kind of come in there, and I think a good competition always helps out everybody involved. So that's a good situation I think for Nebraska special teams. Yeah, I don't think that they're having the same types of results, and I think it's just because Nebraska's still trying to find, the right depth, the right kind of competition, those pieces that kind of yield a better room, and not just putting an extra body in the room just for the sake of putting a body in the room. You also got like the wide receiver that you mentioned, Miller, and he's coming in to, play slot. And obviously Nebraska, they brought in a couple longer portal transfer wide receivers, but, the room needs a little bit more depth. You got Lloyd, you bring in the JUCO guy, and it gives you a chance now to kind of say you've got some depth. You can roll through some different guys, and that'll be very helpful. But I just don't feel like the other schools are kind of still looking for the kind of help that Nebraska is at certain positions.
So you mentioned that Nebraska is doing this with a purpose, right? It seems to very much fit the Matt Rule ethos that Nebraska is look anywhere and everywhere for talent to find a guy that can help you. Yeah. If these guys aren't going to make a difference on the field, it kind of, leads me to the point of, well, why are you go getting say the scholarships are just extra bodies. But Matt Rule seems to think that, especially a guy like Gramstad, right, with the player of the year, two-time captain, national champion, can help. What do you think these guys' impact will be on the field if they start, third on the depth chart, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna, I mean, Gramstad, probably third, potentially fourth coming in, got to learn the offense, so then it comes down to capability. And you had to pay pretty close attention to like what Matt Rule was saying about him last week, because there was some interesting timing between, Matt Rule being interviewed by Sean and Sip, on the Husker Online show, and to where Gramstad's commitment was announced, and they started talking about him like even playing safety. So I think that they feel like they got a great athlete. I think that they still feel like there's maybe potentially a hole like in the room of quarterback, where he could fit. So I think that's where he starts out, but it just kind of depends, I think, how next season kind of goes. But I do feel like, just Nebraska has gotten very fortunate, and they've been kind of looking, they're turning over some stones, and some of these things have kind of fallen into their lap. I think for I think for, Nebraska to kind of say that they're really back, that there'll be far fewer of these things kind of moving forward. I really feel like, you get those guys you add like Hoskin, or even like a guy like Mekhi Nelson, who I'm sure we'll talk about here very, very shortly. Those are showing, that you really don't have that kind of person, on your roster currently. And it's darn near July. And, and you're talking about 4 weeks before the start of fall camp. And so you're really talking about conditioning for 3 weeks, because they'll be off during the week of the 4th of July. And then you're going to roll right into fall camp, and then let's see what you got. And so there's a lot, there's going to be a fire hose there for them in Lincoln to kind of get everything up to speed conditioning wise and up to speed in the playbook.
You mentioned Mekhi Nelson. I think that's a good jumping off point here. Longstanding relationship with EJ Barthel. Two things really stand out to me, Brian. The first of which is that he's reclassifying from 25 to 24. As a college basketball junkie, I know that happens a lot in that sport, but what precipitated him wanting to, move his timeline up a year, and how common is that in college football?
Well, so it's a very interesting scenario with him. So he was actually class of 24 before. He graduated from Wilkes-Barre High School in Pennsylvania last December. Literally, when he entered into his senior year, he needed 0.5 credits to complete his senior year. And he knew that he would be done at semester. It just didn't yield for him the, kind of where he felt like he needed to be when it came to getting to that type of school. So he elected to go to prep school. He started prep school in spring, reclassified 2025 with prep school in mind, went to St. Thomas More. And while spring's kind of going on, traffic is better going through the prep school to come out there and see him. Nebraska gets really, refamiliarized with him because, of that relationship that you mentioned before, going back to UConn between Barthel and Nelson. And then he wins the Under Armour Next Combine for the second year in a row. And that's really, what kind of started things off. But I think here that the real value is that he's a tremendous athlete. Number one, they worked him out at several positions. I mean, he this summer when he's at summer camp, he did running back, he did corner, he did defensive back, and he also did wide receiver. But I think the real value here was that he had this option. He had the option to get back in to take that spot in the class that, was left kind of open by Kanan Lacy, decommitting from Nebraska late in the process and going to Missouri. I think Nebraska, no matter even going out there and getting Dante Dowdle, I don't feel like Nebraska felt like they really satisfied what they needed to do to that room. And Mekhi Nelson was really kind of a godsend, and he's a tremendous player. I mean, He's got great speed. He's very electric. Reminds you a little bit like of a Jamarian Parker. I mean, but he's bigger than Parker. It's going to be very interesting to see, what Nebraska ends up doing with him, and maybe how, he takes to the room, because that room's pretty deep now, and it's going to be fun to watch to see how things kind of go and move in through the fall.
You mentioned the positional versatility. Do you think he ends up at running back? Do you think he ends up at a DB? If you've watched him, what's your gut tell you?
Yeah, I think for now, I think that the whole, not having that 2024 guy in the class keeps him in the room. And then, you bring Parker and you bring Booth in, right, in the 2025 group. And then I think you have to do an assessment. And I think it would be just like, Matt Rule and his staff to kind of do that after a year. Did we just recruit over you? Did we find a couple of guys that are going to put even more distance between you and the playing field regularly? And if that's the kind of question that they're getting that kind of possibly or yes answer to, then absolutely. I think that he's going to be the person that they're going to talk about, because I think he's just way too athletic, way too versatile to kind of sit there and be, that fourth or fifth option in that room. So it's really going to kind of depend like how the room's kind of made up. Obviously that very surprising news, that Gabe Ervin was maybe close to transferring out, this spring. So you've always got that kind of, not necessarily, build up on the best foundation, that you got guys are always going to be there. They can leave for any reason. We saw plenty of it, this spring with Chief Borders. So it's interesting. They've got great depth there. But, yeah, he would be a guy I think starts out in running back, but probably could be a guy that they talk about, like where else could he fit and get on the field quicker.
Bryan, if you could refresh people's memory, you mentioned Kanan Lacy, the decommitment, obviously, from the 24 class, but there had to be more than that. Why else wasn't Nebraska able to get a running back in the 24 class?
I think by the time that they started to turn the page on the 24 class, they did lock on to another running back in Texas, and turned out he had massive academic issues. And he was having a great year. He was the first, what was his claim to fame? He was the guy that got to 1,000 yards the quickest in the entire nation. And as it turned out, I think it was after like 4 games. It was like 4 or 5 games. He already had 1,000 yards rushing. But then by the time I think Nebraska had a chance to vet it, academically, there was just no chance that he was going to make, be able to get qualified. So I think Nebraska always knew there's going to be a challenge to keep Kanan in the boat. Ole Miss, was down there the very first week that they could show up to see him during the evaluation period in the fall. There were a number of new offers that kind of made their way out to him. And despite the fact, of course, that he told me that he was still solid the week before he decommitted, it just seemed like it was one of those things where it could change at any moment, but at the same time, he could end up being a Husker. It just kind of was one of those coin flips. So I just don't think Nebraska felt like there was anybody else out there that could really help them out in the way that like Kanan Lacy was going to be able to do it. And Kanan was, he was a wide receiver, he was a returner, and he was a running back, and that was a 10-4 100 guy. So he was an incredible athlete.
We're talking with Bryan Munson of Husker Online here on our Allo VIP line, where they understand the importance of exceptional service with local heart. This one from the text line, Bryan, for you, I think it's worth bringing up. I've kind of turned the page because I think the rumblings are one way, not the other. But one of our texters says, anything new on Dawson Meritt?
Not yet. And I'm actually pretty surprised that we made it through the weekend without kind of hearing news, whether it was good or it was bad. I stay in pretty close contact with Chad Simmons, and it gets to a point like with guys that are, Merritt's caliber, it just, you don't want the team guys calling them. You want kind of a single point of contact for each one of the networks that is going out there and distributing the information, obviously. But Chad was supposed to catch up with Dawson on Friday, and that conversation never happened. I think there was some. I think the news that's been getting out is people trying to read the tea leaves. Number one, I don't think there's any real new information that's been released. I think it's just been kind of defaulting back to the fact that, apparently Meritt was very close to committing to Alabama 2 other times before. And, then just Nebraska's always been there kind of in the back of his mind. So you really hope that that's kind of where still things are at. You just got to wonder right now whether Nebraska is the head or the heart when it comes to Meritt. And I think that that's going to be an interesting thing here to kind of keep watching. It's not going to be like this overall, like kind of like business decision and NIL is going to play out. That's not the way this is going to work with Meritt, I don't think. I think he's going to go because it's going to get him the most ready to play at the next level. I think early playing time obviously gets into the equation. I think Nebraska still has that best opportunity for him, clearly with what's kind of going on with their class and with the depth chart there versus I think, there's 2 or 3 other linebackers already in the class for Alabama that are rated, very, very similarly to Dawson. So I think that there's still plenty of things here that make Nebraska, kind of a very competitive choice, even if it is against Alabama. It's not Saban's Alabama, but I mean, they're right now that, DeBoer's got them up there as like the number 1, number 2 rated recruiting class in the country.
Bama gonna Bama. They remain the Crimson Tide. Kind of taking a bigger picture look at college football here, Bryan. The Division I Council looks like it's going to vote again on the number of countable coaches and getting rid of that limit. Do you think it would be a good idea for the D1 Council to, abolish the limit on countable coaches, so pretty much anyone in the building can be an on-field coach?
I don't know about good idea. I think it's going to get voted in. I mean, from the people that I kind of talk to and converse with, it sounds like it's moving that way. I definitely see that there's an advantage, to it, to where you have that ability instructionally to be able to kind of work with those guys. I think obviously Scott Frost's staff had gotten in trouble for that before. It'd be something I think is positive for the players. I think it's positive for the staff. I think you can do a lot more developmentally, with your staff. You can kind of get guys like ready. You can kind of work bigger picture. You're probably looking at having some extra people into your meetings, to kind of help out with things. So, I think it would be a good move, obviously, because it helps with the distribution of information and the instruction, obviously, out there on the football field.
When it comes to recruiting, we know there's a limit on the number of, recruiters that can actually, travel off site. Would that be impacted by this new change?
It sounds like it could. Well, in Nebraska does kind of do some substitutions like that from time to time. They have a couple of coaches that, have passed the NCAA ethics test, where they've had to kind of pull some guys out, or they push some guys in because they have, ties to the area. Coach Dawson a year ago, kind of is along those same lines, wasn't a full-time coach. Had plenty of ties down to Florida. However, so he and, whether it was Coach Cooper or Coach Barthel, would head on down to South Florida to kind of get back into his stomping ground. And that really helped, Nebraska last year to get out like McGahee and Barney and others, out of that area. So, and Tarver, excuse me, as well. I was going to forget him. I think that would be something that would kind of widen the base to where you would probably have more guys, more folks on your staff that have been ready, to kind of jump on the road if they need to, because of the ethics test, taking the ethics test, which is really the thing that stands in the way from them being able to kind of go out there and recruit anyway. But that would be something, obviously, I think that would go hand in hand with it, because obviously some of them are already talking to recruits, and I got a lot of mentions from recruits this weekend that to other staff members that aren't full-time coaches. So I think, Rule and his staff are very deep, and they're working this very, very differently, and getting other people involved that have, responsibilities in the room, helping out and stuff like that, that this could be a real boost to them, because I think of the size of their staff, number one, and I think just the quality and the depth of it as well.
I'm glad you went that way. I want to end with this sort of discussion real quick, Bryan, is that on the one hand, I think Nebraska being the developmental program, having increased staff size in a lot of areas, might just be like title change or slight responsibility change because they have a lot of people in the building. But at the same time, Matt Rule's all about buy-in, right? Culture, preaching it, being completely in line, getting good people in the building. The bigger a staff is, the harder it is to make sure everyone's, in line and doing the right thing. Is there a risk at all for Nebraska to go, overboard with getting too many people, too many cooks in the kitchen? Or do you think Nebraska is pretty well set up to where you feel good about Matt Rule's message and the people he's bringing in, that it wouldn't be an issue?
I think it depends on how your span of control is divided up. I think that you obviously have people leaders, and you'll have to put them, in charge of those that you're kind of mentioning, more boots on the ground, the ones that are a little bit more recruit personnel, family facing, and whether or not they're getting the job done, whether or not they're hitting the mark when it comes to, that person's very easy to talk to. I think Nebraska and Matt Rule, I'd be very surprised, in fact, if this wasn't happening. I would bet that they are very interested in the feedback, on their staff, on the people that they connect with, on the people that are hitting the mark, the people that obviously it just wasn't happening, and ways to kind of train that, ways to kind of keep that, kind of going, or finding another role for them, or maybe possibly them, having lead Nebraska. But I would be shocked if there wasn't almost like a Google survey that almost like that the parents would get to ask about, hey, you worked with blah, blah, blah. How was your connection? Did you find that they were attentive? Did you find that they were able to answer your questions without having to go ask other questions themselves, et cetera? That really, though, comes back to, like I said, that span of control and making sure that you have somebody there that's in the know, that understands that, that's evaluating that, and is on top of that about the people that are really kind of leading in that area, or the ones that are basically kind of they're trying to get maybe even like covered up by the numbers and the density and the quantity of the other people that are kind of around. I think that you run the risk potentially of hiding some people, but I think Matt Rule and his staff have ways to kind of get that to come to light.
That's Bryan Munson, that other voice you're hearing. He joins us Mondays at 2:30 to talk all things Husker football recruiting. He's with Husker Online. Check him out, huskeronline.com. Bryan, as always, appreciate the update and your time. We'll catch up again soon.
See you, buddy.